Jesus is the foundation of God's house today. God inhabits the church. When we assemble together and we worship God in spirit and in truth, that passage that was just read for us, it teaches us that's where God's presence is today. If we're going to think about God's presence on earth today, where is He today? It's within the church, within the worship assembly. The church, the temple, is the people. That's what the New Testament teaches. This is God's temple today, you and me. Now, this was not true for the ancient Jews. When they spoke about the temple, they were speaking about an actual building with a location, a building in Jerusalem. And Jesus prophesied that building would be destroyed. If you have your Bible, please open it with me to Matthew's Gospel account. We're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 24 this morning. Matthew chapter 24. Every so often I've been preaching through the Gospel account of Matthew. And I've made it to the beginning of chapter 24. And when we look at this chapter, the main idea in this chapter is the destruction of the temple and the end of the world. Those are the two major ideas in this context: the destruction of the temple and the end of the world. Now, today it's going to be a two-part sermon. The points I'd like us to focus on in this context are these: the question, the collapse, and the consummation. And in this morning's sermon, I'm just going to cover those first 2 points. And if everything goes according to plan, when we return in the evening, I'll cover the third point for the evening sermon. So this is going to be a two-part sermon. So this morning, we're going to cover the question. Jesus speaks about the temple being destroyed. Clearly, that got the attention of His disciples, and they came asking Him some questions. And then Jesus speaks about the collapse, again, the collapse or the destruction of the temple. And we'll get into that this morning. And then after that, He speaks about the consummation or the end of all things, the end of the world. And again, we'll do that in the evening. Matthew 24 reminds us that the Jewish system of faith was providentially ended by God. Now, that's not politically correct today. Even among some people who claim to be Christians, they have this idea that somehow God is going to save the Jewish people separate and apart from the gospel of Christ. That is not a Christian message. That is not the message of the New Testament. Again, we look at the words of Jesus Himself, who was a faithful Jew. He said the temple was going to be destroyed. And He knew it was going to happen because that was God's will, that was God's plan. And again, the ultimate symbol or sign of the Old Testament system coming to its end. Christianity is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. Christianity is the belief system that God has chosen for all people today, that they believe in it and that they utilize it. And so let's begin with, again, the question. We're just going to cover, again, the 2 points this morning, the third point in the evening, Lord willing. So again, we're in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, starting with verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple. So again, this is the Jewish temple located in Jerusalem, or it was located in Jerusalem. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came to Him to show Him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as He sat upon the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came unto Him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of Thy coming and the end of the world? All right, so this first section here, this first point, I'm going to keep very brief, but again, Jesus saw the temple, came from the temple. His disciples, the temple, I understand it in Jesus' time, was quite an amazing structure, even beautiful. So the disciples wanted to show Him certain parts of the building or some kind of comment about, again, how the temple looked. And Jesus, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but this is all going to be thrown down, He says. Well, clearly that got their attention. For a Jew in that time, for someone to make that claim that the temple is going to be destroyed, that's a huge claim. So they come to Jesus and ask him several questions, right? Notice one of the things they mentioned there in verse 3, they not only did they ask him, when will this happen, right? Jesus is referring to the temple being thrown down, destroyed. When will that happen? But notice also in verse 3, they ask about the end of the world. The end of the world. Some translations say the end of the age. Again, referring to like the end of time as we know it here on earth. In Matthew 24, there's two important questions answered. Number one, when would the temple be destroyed? And then number two, when will the world end? And I'm going to again cover that second answer to that question about the end of the world in the evening sermon tonight. So again, Jesus provided two separate answers to each question. So again, this morning, let's consider what Jesus said about the destruction of the temple. So again, the question, number two, the collapse. So again, this is Jesus' answer about when these things would happen. Again, referring to the temple being thrown down. Now, we're going to do a little bit of a lengthier read. I encourage you to follow along. I'm going to pick up with verse 4, Matthew 24, verse 4. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. And these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. And ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Verse 10, and then shall many be offended. Then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise and deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back in to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall rise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. I've told you before, verse 25. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there shall the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with the power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Verse 32, Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know the summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So, like I said, that's quite a long reading. I know that's a lot of text. And if I went into a lot of detail, I could turn that into a dozen or more sermons, right? Lots of information there. My goal this morning is to give you one sermon. And, I want to sit in the back and eat some food with you back there. So, again, I don't want to take too much time. I won't be expounding on, again, every single detail and every single verse in this context. I'm going to, again, try to give you the high points this morning. So, regarding everything we just read, again, we read from verse 1 all the way through verse 35. Notice the time frame Jesus gives. Verse 34. Verse 34. Verily I say unto you, truly I say unto you, this generation, notice he says, shall not pass till a few of these things be fulfilled. Till some of these things be fulfilled. No, it says, till all these things be fulfilled. So everything we've just read, up this first part of the chapter, everything up through verse 34, everything would be accomplished within the lifetime of Jesus' original audience, within that generation. And again, if you like to take notes or highlight in your Bible, I think verse 34 is a key verse in understanding this whole context. And again, there's a lot of people who, whether intentionally or unintentionally, don't understand this passage and take things out of context and make this chapter quite more confusing than it is. So again, you look at everything we've just read, Jesus mentions some very intense things, some strange things, and again, wars and rumors of wars, the Son of Man coming, and the sign in the clouds, and angels coming with the trumpet, and people can get excited about those things and begin to pluck those things out of the context and start to apply them in ways which have nothing to do with what Jesus is talking about. So again, context is so important here. So let me just try to really hammer this home. Everything in Matthew 24, verses 1 through 35, everything we've just read, verses 1 through 35, everything he's talking about is regarding the destruction of the temple and nothing else. Jesus has not yet talked about the end of the world. He has not yet talked about His return and God's judgment or anything like that. Again, He will talk about that in verses 36 and following, which will be my focus in the evening sermon. But again, everything in verses 1 through 35 is about the destruction of the temple and, again, Jerusalem itself being destroyed. Jesus warned His followers about wars and rumors of wars. And if you take those things out of context, because people will try to say the wars, the rumors of wars, the earthquakes, the pestilences or the diseases, all those are signs leading up to the second coming of Christ. And if you try to apply those things to a global scale, they become meaningless because there's always wars happening in the world, the globe. There's always earthquakes. There's always diseases. And every time there's some notable war or something, like Russia fighting against Ukraine or whatever it is, people who don't understand this passage will turn to it like, look, these are signs of the end. No, these are not signs of the end. Again, what Jesus is talking about referred to not the world, but Judea and Jerusalem. And that's the only way wars and earthquakes and pestilences can have significance when it's talking about a specific location in the world. Again, if you try to apply it to the whole globe, it becomes meaningless. Because again, these things are happening all the time throughout the world. Again, Jesus warned His followers about wars and rumors of wars. Violent times were coming for those who lived in Judea, for those who lived in Jerusalem. And when war reached the doorstep of Jerusalem, notice Jesus told His audience to flee, to run away. Look at verse 16. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Right? So He says flee, right? He says run away. When you see all these things happening, run to the mountains. That was His message. Now, in Luke, we find a parallel to this account. Luke gives us some important details, I think, which help clear things up. A lot of the same information, but some additional information, complementary information as well. So Luke 21, verses 20 and 21, when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein. So he's picturing Judea being surrounded by an invading force, by an army. And he's saying, when you see all this about to happen, get out of there as quickly as you can. Right? Run to the mountains. Don't get your stuff. Don't stop and take your time. If you're, outside of the city already, don't go back in. Just get out of there as quickly as you can. That's the whole point of his message here. And then also in the same section here in Luke, in 21:24, it says, they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem, again, notice, not the world, not the entire earth, not the globe, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So again, Jesus is talking about a very specific location and events happening in Judea, again, even smaller, the city of Jerusalem. So Matthew's account, Jesus refers to a prophecy made by Daniel, and it rhymes, right? It's kind of memorable. The abomination of desolation. Sounds very mysterious. Well, what is that? The abomination of desolation. Again, Luke refers to the same thing, but it doesn't rhyme here, right? Know that the desolation thereof is nigh. The desolation of what? Jerusalem, right? For Gentiles. So again, this invading army that would come would be the Romans. They'd be Gentiles. And for Gentiles to enter into the temple of God, that was seen as an abomination to the Jewish people. Gentiles were not allowed in the holy place of God. Again, under the Mosaic system, the law of Moses. So that's what the abomination of desolation is referring to, or at least that's the application Jesus is making for that generation. The Gentiles coming, destroying Jerusalem, destroying the temple, entering into that sacred ground, that holy ground. Again, there are people in the religious world who unfortunately think everything we've read this morning, that these things are referring to the second coming of Christ, the end of all things. But think about this critically, and think about what we've read in Matthew, think about these few verses we've read in Luke, the parallel account of Luke. Can a person run away from the second coming of Christ? Can we run to the mountains when God comes to judge the world? Is that going to work? Oh no, God's coming. Let's get it. Let's run away into the country. That's going to work. Again, what does it say in Matthew's account? What does Jesus tell them to do? Look at verse 16 again. Matthew 24:16. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Can a person run to the mountains to escape the judgment of God and the end of all things, the end of time? No. Again, that just makes no sense. You can't run away from the judgment of God. Of course not. But a person living in Jerusalem and Judea in the first century, when they saw the Romans coming, they could run away from that if they had enough time and they were paying attention. And you could run away from an invading army. So again, I just want to reiterate, because it is not because of the text, but because of people's view of the text, this passage can be quite confusing to some people. Again, everything in these first verses that we've read, 1 through 35, is all about the Romans coming, destroying Jerusalem, destroying the temple. Jesus prophesied this would happen, and he gave them, again, notice he said to them, I tell you this before it happens. And he gave them this knowledge quite a bit in advance. We count our time by the birth of Christ. And so when Jesus was living, and he said these things, it was approximately the year 30, 33. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. So he's telling them about something that would happen 40 years in their future. Right? 40 years in their future, thereabouts. Right? The year 70. And it's a historical fact. I don't know of anyone who doubts this, but it's just a historical fact that the temple was destroyed in the year 70. In fact, you can do a quick internet search of Google Images, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem today. There is no temple of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem today. It's still gone because the Romans destroyed it, just as Jesus said it would. There are some ancient historians who write about its destruction. Eusebius was an early Christian historian who lived in the late 200s, even into the 300s. So again, this is not an inspired writing. This is just an early Christian who wrote about history. Again, his name is Eusebius, if you're interested in looking up his works and reading them. And he says this, quote, "On the other hand, the people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. To it, those who believed on Christ migrated from Jerusalem, that when holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea, the judgment of God might at last overtake them for all the crimes against the Christ and his apostles, and all that generation of the wicked be utterly blotted out from among men." End quote. So notice here, he talks about those, how does he put it? Those who believed on Christ did what? They migrated from Jerusalem. They left Jerusalem. They got out of Jerusalem when they saw that war was imminent and the Romans were going to invade. In the same section, he goes on and says this, and again, he's talking about the destruction of the temple here. He says, they can study the nature of the whole war. So again, the Romans, and it's a real complicated issue, and I don't have time to get into it, but the Romans started a war, or depending on how you look at it, the Jews started a war with the Romans, but the two started fighting. They had an all-out war. And he says they can study the nature of the whole war, all the details of what happened in it, and how at the end the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet was set up in the very temple of God for all its ancient fame, and it perished utterly and passed away in flames. So again, regarding the temple, Eusebius is saying it's just completely gone. It perished utterly, it passed away in flames. The temple was destroyed just as Jesus said it would be. And again, it happened within the time frame he gave. And he says specifically, and there's other historians who note this as well, but again, those who believed in Jesus, those who heard this message, or at least read about this message in later years as the New Testament was being preached and recorded, this would have really stuck in the mind of someone who had a Jewish background. The temple being destroyed would have been a life-altering event. To this very day, 2024, Jews will go to where the temple used to be and there offer prayers to God. That's how life-altering this event was, even today, for those who still practice the Jewish faith. Jesus warned his audience about false prophets. Again, there's a lot of interesting things he says here. I don't have time to get into all of it, but he did warn his audience about false prophets, those who come in claiming to be Christ and claiming to be prophets and so on. A different historian named Josephus lived in the 1st century, and he lived through the period when the temple was destroyed, and even directly after the temple was destroyed. And according to Josephus, before the Romans invaded, the Romans sent false prophets into Jerusalem, and their message to the people was, stay. Don't go anywhere. God is going to save us. God is going to deliver us from our enemies. Again, that was a lie. It was a purposeful deception. In war, people will spread misinformation to destroy their enemy. That's exactly what the Romans did. The Romans sent false prophets into Jerusalem telling the people to stay. And sadly, Jesus says many of them believe. Many people believe the message, believe the message of false prophets. And they died horrible deaths, horrifying deaths. Again, if you read in the history of when Jerusalem was destroyed, Some people died because of cannibalism. The war of attrition, right? The Romans cut off all their supplies and everything, no food. What are you going to do? So here's an important lesson. You look at everything Jesus said, if I could just summarize it, Jesus says, when you see these things happening, go. Get out of there. Run to the mountains. Run for your life, is what he's saying. These false prophets come in and say, stay. Everything's going to be great. God's going to save us. Well, whose message are you going to believe? Because obviously those are two opposite ideas. And so again, here's an important lesson. Do not refuse the true and inspired words of the Lord for false teaching, for false message. Again, it's always going to cost you. Whether it's something pertaining to this life, like again, this is a very physical description of things, real life events. But whether it's physical or spiritual, again, if you believe in lies, it's going to cost you. I think that's a really important lesson we ought to glean from this context. Now, one thing that is admittedly difficult about interpreting this section of Scripture is that some of the language does indeed sound like the end of the world, and Jesus describing the end of all things, especially verses 29 through 31. And if you look at verses 29 through 31, that's where Jesus again speaks about the moon no longer giving light, stars falling from heaven. He even talks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds with His angels. Well, that sure sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? And again, if we know other New Testament passages, again, that fits quite well with other passages that talk about the end of things and the return of Christ. So again, that does sound a lot like the end of the world. Well, this is why context is so important. Context is crucial in understanding anything in the Bible. And again, you look at those things Jesus said, verses 29 through 31, about the moon no longer shining, the stars falling, Christ coming in the clouds, and so on. All that said, and then we come to verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. So again, everything Jesus said about the moon not giving light, the stars falling, and so on, that would be fulfilled in the generation He spoke to. Again, He's not talking about the end of all time as we know it, or things happening in our future. It has no application if you look at the context. Again, that's why verse 34 here is so important in how this text unfolds. Verses 29 through 31, Jesus is using something called apocalyptic language. It is a heightened and poetic way of speaking to describe a very important event, a life-altering event. Jesus did indeed come in the clouds with His angels and return to Jerusalem within that lifetime's generation, or that generation's lifetime. I got that backwards. But again, He did not come literally, and certainly He did not come to end the world. We would all know if the world ended in the year 70. We wouldn't be here. Again, Christ returned providentially, meaning His words came to pass exactly as He said they would. Again, everything He said would happen happened in the year 70. In that sense, Christ came, and God judging the people at that time. Well, someone might say, well, that's rather convenient. Someone who believes it's His time about then. Well, that's rather convenient. You just say it's figurative. What proof do you have? Well, there's plenty of proof. And I would encourage you, again, we don't have time to read all these references, but I encourage you to jot down these following references. And I'll give you quick 2 verses from this, and we'll be done this morning. This same kind of language is used in Isaiah 13, verses 6 through 13, to describe the destruction of the Babylonian Empire. This same kind of language is used in Isaiah 34, verse 4, to describe the destruction of the nation of Edom. And the same kind of language is used in Ezekiel 32, verses 7 through 9, to speak about the destruction of the Egyptians. And just think about it, when you're part of a nation that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, that's all you've ever known, for that nation to stop existing, it's almost something you can't comprehend. And so this language of the sun being darkened, the moon no longer giving its light, the stars falling from heaven, it's like these things that are fixed to never change, all of a sudden they're changing. And that's what it would be like to be in a war where your nation is literally destroyed by an invading army or another nation. It's these things that never change are all of a sudden changing. Your circumstances in life are changing forever. Again, that's what it would have been like for a Jew having the temple destroyed by the Romans. So again, when Jesus prophesied here about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, he used this same kind of figurative language that's used in other places in the Old Testament. He's using scriptural language to talk about the temple's destruction. And just two quick examples. Isaiah 13, verse 10, and these are both from these references on the screen. Isaiah 13, verse 10, it says, "The stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine." That sounds quite a bit like what we read here in Matthew, doesn't it? But again, that's back in Isaiah. Also, Isaiah 34, verse 4. Isaiah 34, 4. And again, this is about the destruction of Edom. So this is about nations ending. "And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. And all the host shall fall down as the leaf falleth from the vine, and as the falling fig from the fig tree." Now again, we have to know that's not literal. You know, if the heavens, if the sky in outer space, if that rolled up like a scroll and all the stars fell down to earth like a fig falls to the ground, again, I think we'd know that happened. I think we would be aware of just everything disappearing in life. We wouldn't be here, right? So again, clearly this is figurative language, again, describing the end of a nation, the end of an era, a life-altering event. Again, this is the kind of language Jesus uses when he talks about Jerusalem being invaded, the temple destroyed. He uses this apocalyptic language that the prophets of the Old Testament used. God did not merely allow the temple to be destroyed because the Jews were rebelling against him. That happened in the past, in the Old Testament, by the way. So the temple in Jesus' time was actually a temple that had been rebuilt, a new temple. The temple in the first century. So the temple was destroyed again in Jesus' time, or again shortly after Jesus' time on earth. The temple was destroyed as a symbolic act to show Judaism had ended. Jesus prophesied of Jerusalem's coming destruction. And his words find fulfillment. And again, it's just a historical fact. His words find their fulfillment in the year 70. AD 70, or the year of our Lord 70, when the general Titus, the general of the Roman army, went into Jerusalem and he just overtook it, destroyed it. And this time, the Jews were not allowed to come back and rebuild their beloved temple. Again, to this very day, there is no Jewish temple on Mount Zion. You know, shortly after the temple was destroyed, the Romans actually put a pagan temple there to the god Jupiter or Zeus. And then through a series of events, eventually that temple was just left to rot and fade away because Christians overtook that area of the world. And it's some people, no one knows for sure, but people think Christians dismantled the temple of Zeus that was on the Temple Mount, and it was just left bare for quite a number of years. But then I want to say it's the 7th century, I might be wrong, but Muslims invaded the Holy Lands and overtook that area and built a Muslim mosque there. And if you look at the Temple Mount today, there is a Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount, but not a Jewish temple. So again, to this very day, there is no temple of God on Mount Zion. Christians are God's temple today. Wherever faithful men and women assemble to worship God in spirit and truth, that is where God's house is. I'll leave you with this last verse this morning. Consider the words of the Apostle Peter. He says, "Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." So the idea here, the picture is each one of us is a stone. Each one of us come together and we're a brick in God's house today. So again, we come together as members of God's house, as members of God's temple. And that's where God's house is today. That's where God's presence is today. It's within the church. And again, Peter's not talking about the Old Testament and the Jews and so on. He's talking about spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God, again, through God's Son, through Jesus Christ. Let us be members of God's house today and encourage all people to accept Jesus as the foundation of said house. May we glorify God through Him.